Thank you to TaxWatch as well. I was privileged to speak at an event that TaxWatch co-hosted in Tallahassee about a year ago, and I'm honored to be back here today for your 40th anniversary celebration. I admire the work that all of you do to keep state government accountable and to bring to light the real-world impact of fiscal and economic policies on the American people. I want to talk to you today about how my work as General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission intersects with this important mission. As Marva mentioned, the FCC is the federal agency in Washington, D.C. that since 1934 has been responsible for regulating the ever-evolving technologies that we all use to communicate, from radio to television to broadband internet. And one of the FCC's principal goals is to promote the efficient deployment of these technologies to all Americans. Now, it may not surprise you to learn that a federal agency in Washington, D.C. has not always done the best job of fulfilling that mandate. Indeed, at times, the Commission has made horrible predictions about the future of technology in deciding how to allocate radio spectrum, the scarce public resource that facilitates wireless communication. You heard earlier today at lunch about Walt Disney's vision for a futuristic city and how well that plan came to pass. We at times have made Disney look like Nostradamus. In fact, just to name two examples, our poor regulatory judgments led to a delay in the advent of FM radio and commercial cellular phone service for decades. Now, these sorts of mistakes come at a tremendous cost to the American economy, whether measured in jobs, consumer welfare, or GDP. In fact, the FCC's repeated missteps have led a friend of mine, Professor Hadley Arkes at the James Wilson Institute, to remark that the FCC doesn't really have 70 years experience. It's just had the same bad experience 70 times. That's why, much like TaxWatch, one of the Commission's chief priorities under the current chairman, Chairman Pai, has been to serve as a watchdog to identify and repeal bad regulations and learn from the lessons of the past. To that end, we've streamlined or repealed rules that are outdated, unduly burdensome, or reflect incorrect assumptions about how technology or the market works. Now, we're not doing this for its own sake. By eliminating regulations that impose unnecessary costs on the economy, our actions protect the American consumer, facilitate the deployment of new communications networks to connect distant communities, and help close the so-called digital divide. The digital divide is the phenomenon where densely populated and more prosperous urban areas of the country have better access to modern communications networks than less affluent communities or the sparsely populated rural parts of the country. By reducing regulatory burdens and creating the right incentives, the Commission can help facilitate network build-out throughout the country to ensure that as technology advances, no community is left behind. Now, perhaps of particular interest to TaxWatch, one way we do this is by identifying state and local regulations that impose burdens on network deployment that are contrary to the public interest. Now, the Communications Act envisions an important role for the states and municipal actors in regulating local communications networks. That's consistent with our American tradition of federalism, the idea that states and localities, being closer to the people, ought to have a say on those issues that uniquely affect their own communities. But there are some issues of a national character that when state and local governments either exceed their authority or act in their own narrow self-interest, it can actually be detrimental to the people that they represent. And that's often true in the communications space, where providers need to deploy regional and national networks that can crisscross up to 50 state and potentially hundreds or thousands of local jurisdictions. Conflicting state requirements or excessive aggregate state and local fees can prove fatal to a provider's effort to develop and deploy a new technology or network, particularly smaller providers and entrepreneurs who can't afford to take on additional regulatory and litigation risk. Now, many state governments, they recognize this important reality, and they've been helpful partners with the FCC in facilitating the nationwide deployment of next generation or 5G networks. You heard earlier today about how Florida has been an economic and tax policy leader in many ways, and indeed, both Governor DeSantis and former Governor Scott signed model bills last year and in 2017, respectively, that cut municipal red tape to pave the way for providers to deploy 5G networks to help transform the Sunshine State into a smart state. But too often, state and local governments adopt regulations that can resemble Cerberus, the fearsome three-headed god of Greek mythology that guarded the gates to hell. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, there are three fearsome aspects to excessive state and local regulation in the communication space. First, these rules often impose hidden taxes. For example, a town might adopt a fee from a provider to process a zoning application. Now, that cost is in turn passed down to the consumer in the form of a higher bill, making it harder for both voters and groups like TaxWatch to track such a tax and hold government actors accountable. Second, and worse, these taxes are regressive, meaning that they increase the cost of phone or cable service equally for everyone, and therefore disproportionately hurt lower income Americans. And third, like Cerberus, the taxes are often imposed simply because the government can act as a gatekeeper and has the power to impose rents in exchange for access, as opposed to furthering some legitimate public purpose. The upshot of these state and local rules is a phenomenon that Stephen Tellis in National Affairs has called the kludgeocracy. It's the regressive redistribution of wealth caused by the sheer complexity of government regulation at the federal, state, and local level. Not only do these rules impose higher costs on lower income Americans, but they also benefit those wealthier individuals and entities with sufficient resources to navigate this complex system and exploit opportunities for arbitrage. Now, the FCC has a tool that can help minimize some of this complexity and unfairness. It is preemption, the ability of the federal government to create a national rule to displace state laws when doing so would be in the public interest. No less a conservative legal giant than Justice Antonin Scalia, who earlier in his career served as an advisor in the White House on communications issues, argued in 1982 that conservatives ought to be prepared to use preemption to effectuate national policy goals. He wrote, quote, "Inaction has less to do with the merits than with the unfortunate tendency of conservatives to regard the federal government, at least in its purely domestic activities, as something to be resisted, or better yet, when conservatives are in power, undone, rather than as a legitimate and useful instrument of policy," unquote. His point that while federal power is often and perhaps very frequently misused, there are areas where conservatives can effectively wield it to promote the common good. One example that the justice used that we're still dealing with today, and Marva alluded to it, is cable franchise regulation. Under the Communications Act, municipalities are entitled to charge fees in exchange for a franchise that gives cable operators the privilege of providing service to residents. As the justice pointed out, even in the early 1980s, that system resulted in competing applicants promising free and discounted service and other favors to state and local governments in exchange for the franchise. Now, while Congress has capped the fee that municipalities can charge providers at 5% of total cable revenue, local governments would try to evade this limit by disregarding these so-called in-kind contributions, like free cable service to the government, when calculating the 5% cap. In his article, Justice Scalia noted it was curious that conservatives had never tried doing anything at the federal level to counteract this trend. Well, this past August, the Commission adopted a rule interpreting the Communications Act that required local franchising authorities, or LFAs for short, to include many of these in-kind contributions toward the statutory 5% cap. Now, this is good news for consumers. It's simple math. The costs imposed by LFAs ultimately get passed on to cable viewers. As Chairman Pai put it in his statement adopting our reforms, LFAs, quote, "have not cracked the secret to a free lunch." In addition, every dollar paid in excessive fees is a dollar that could be spent deploying new services like faster home broadband or better Wi-Fi or emerging Internet of Things networks. These are the types of networks we're going to see in the coming years that promise smart homes, precision agriculture, at-home drone delivery, or autonomous cars. The Commission's rule will help prevent these sorts of lost opportunity costs. Now, the Commission has also tried to cut through red tape with respect to infrastructure policy, or rules that affect the incentives that providers have to deploy the network facilities that will support 5G and Internet of Things services. At least 28 states, including Florida, as I mentioned earlier, have enacted model legislation to protect and promote the deployment of so-called small cells, the backpack-sized antennas that will transmit the high-frequency spectrum that delivers 5G services. But other localities, particularly some large cities that were currently involved in litigation on the West Coast, have chosen instead to exact rents from providers rather than joining in furthering the national interest and helping us win the race to 5G. So last September, we exercised our authority to prevent state and local governments from charging excessive fees, and we also established shot clocks for state and local zoning approvals on the placement of new deployments in order to ensure that construction crews can get to work in months, not years. We predicted that this streamlining would lead to major benefits for the public. According to one report, speeding 5G infrastructure deployment by even 1 year would unleash an additional $100 billion for the US economy. According to another study, our rulemaking will eliminate about $2 billion in unnecessary regulatory costs, stimulating about another $2.5 billion in additional build-outs. And that service will be deployed where it is needed most. We predicted that 97% of new deployments would be in rural and suburban communities that would otherwise be on the wrong side of the digital divide. I will offer one more example of how the Commission has reduced costs associated with state and local rulemaking. This was California's infamous attempt in 2018 to impose a text tax. So in 2018, the California Public Utilities Commission considered charging a tax for text messaging of about 70 cents for every $10 of text revenues, a cost that would undoubtedly be passed on to consumers. Studies showed that this tax would have costed California texters up to $44.5 million per year, with, of course, that cost being disproportionately borne by people in the lower income brackets. But luckily, in late 2018, the Commission acted on a petition by mass texting service Twilio to affirm that the proper regulatory classification of texting under the Communications Act was as what's called an information service under Title I of the Act, not a telecommunications service under Title II. So while that might sound like a technical legal conclusion, and it is, it has important real-world consequences because the state public utility commissions have a lot less authority to regulate information services than they do traditional telecommunication services like the landline phone network. So right in the wake of that decision, California responded by pulling the text tax proposal from consideration, which was a huge win for Californians, particularly lower income Californians. So while Texas may be safe from taxes for now, none of these victories has come easy. The states and localities who benefit from these rent-seeking behaviors have fought us tooth and nail at every opportunity. We're currently facing lawsuits from a number of localities, both with respect to the cable franchise reforms I mentioned, as well as with respect to our 5G infrastructure policy. Now, we feel confident that our actions are well supported by the law, but as we prepare for an ever more connected future, we're very aware there is a lot more work to do. I plan to spend much of 2020 making sure that the Commission's hard-fought reforms are upheld in court and continue to deliver value to Americans. And I also look forward to continuing to act and work in good faith with our state and local partners and with good government groups like TaxWatch to identify areas in which we can make regulation simpler and smarter for the benefit of everyone. So thank you again for the invitation, and I'm happy to take some questions. Yes.
Google's become really obviously very you get an unbiased search result when you put in something. But clearly, they put their fingers on or their thumb on the scale of what they want to come out. What's your point of view on Google and whether it needs to be either regulated or broken up?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so, what I'll say at a general level is that this commission has had a consistent policy with respect to internet regulation, which is that whether we're talking about the broadband networks that deliver content, or whether we're talking about content providers themselves like Google, that there should be a light touch approach to regulating the internet, because that's what Congress envisioned when it amended the Communications Act in 1996. And those are the sorts of policies that have resulted in the dynamic growth of the internet over the course of the past 20 years. Now, all that said, I'm not saying that the behavior of Google isn't a problem. What we have said is that traditional consumer protection and enforcement authorities, particularly the Federal Trade Commission, but as well as state consumer protection authorities, ought to be able to step in when these organizations are doing something that is anti-competitive. And that what we ought to have, both with respect to broadband networks, and we impose this directly in our Restoring Internet Freedom Order, which was the net neutrality repeal that Marva mentioned earlier, but also as a policy matter with respect to content providers, which we don't directly regulate, is that we think there ought to be transparency. There, terms of service, the conditions in which any of these providers or social media companies engage in blocking or to the extent to which they're either prioritizing or deprioritizing results, these should be made public so that members of the public are aware, and so that the market can function. And while a lot of these organizations now might seem like essentially they're the only kid on the block, we know, history has shown. Look at the AT&T network, which was considered at one point so dominant that how could anyone ever compete with it given the amount of infrastructure that it has. So part of the approach that we have taken, as I mentioned, is sort of regulatory humility in terms of looking ahead and figuring out what exactly is it what direction are these services going to go. That's why we haven't, unlike commissions of the past, we haven't imposed a heavy-handed approach to regulation, but we do recognize the important role on the back end that enforcement authorities like the FTC play in regulating some of these content providers' conduct. Jeff.
Assuming current technology, and I think that's not necessarily a fair assumption, just assuming that Wi-Fi is more and more, are there any current projections on when we'll max out the Wi-Fi spectrum?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we continually hear is that consumers, they want more spectrum for unlicensed use. And so actually just a week or two ago, the chairman placed a proposal on our December meeting agenda. And so we have monthly meetings in which we consider items every month, but a proposal to make available more of what's called the 5.9 band available for unlicensed use, which could be Wi-Fi use. And so that band is a great example where at one point we thought that was great spectrum to use for essentially automotive safety functions. And it turns out that not as much use of the spectrum was made for that particular technological application. So one of the things that the chairman has been doing is putting proposals out there to change some of these spectrum bands from being assigned to a particular use to being what's called flexible use, meaning that the consumer, rather than a federal agency in Washington, D.C., can decide how best to put it to use. Yes, in the back.
Appreciate the comments around speed and efficiency in the 5G network, but can you kind of talk to the other piece of that, of the opportunity or the ability for states and local communities to receive fair market value for access to the assets that they are responsible for to their constituents, and then the impact on not just providing access to the internet or broadband to suburbs, but to the entire states. In our state, there's the upper band in Northwest Florida, where I'm from. It's not the same as South Florida, and so getting broadband across the entire state is an important thing as it relates to education, not just commerce. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. So let me start with the first piece about state or local authority. So the approach that we've taken on infrastructure policy has been an approach that is respectful of the traditional state and local authority over the deployment of facilities. While our infrastructure item in September recognized that many states were charging excessive fees, the way that we define that was to say that states and localities have the right to recover a reasonable approximation of their costs. The costs involved with processing applications, the costs involved with maintaining the rights of way. And so what we're looking to do is to make sure that states and localities are actually justifying their receipts, that they are tying the cost that they're charging providers to actual costs, as opposed to just engaging in that gatekeeper function that I was talking about. And so that's going to be worked out on it. We set the standard at that high level, and how that's going to flesh out is going to happen on a case by case basis. Now, to mention what you were saying about broadband deployment, it's a very important issue. One of the reasons why we repealed the Obama era net neutrality regulations is because in order to adopt those regulations, what the Obama Commission did was it classified broadband as a Title II telecommunications service. That created a lot of regulatory uncertainty as to what parts of Title II would apply to broadband. And what we were hearing were from smaller rural providers, things, they're called WISPs, wireless internet service providers, that service perhaps a small rural community or farmland where it's very costly, as you know, to build out these networks that you would see in densely populated urban areas. They were being chilled, and they were sort of foregoing investment because of the impact of those regulations. And so we have in place a 5G FAST plan, which seeks to help promote broadband deployment in rural and other parts of the country by cutting back on regulation, by bringing more spectrum to market, and through smart infrastructure policy. And I know that I spoke about this last time I was here. Florida has also been an active participant in our high-cost auctions, in which we have made federal money available to subsidize the cost of deploying networks to areas where otherwise it might be uneconomical. So all of those are pieces of a policy that we hope will help close the digital divide.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Right, thank you very much.
While you work on the digital divide, and net neutrality is so critically important for our state, for our people, and ultimately the taxpaying public and ratepayers, I'd like you to congratulate you on one of the more important accomplishments in your life, and that is Tom will be a father.
No, thank you.
We're so honored, and we have his mother-in-law, father-in-law. In fact, one of the great achievements.
Dom, it's the most important next generation deployment happening in 2020.
So
in my household,
I learned this. I learned this
Yeah.
from Congress. I learned this from Congressman Vern Buchanan. He told me, one of the greatest surprises, most important things is when greatest surprises for a father-in-law, mother-in-law as a successful son. So you're a very successful son. Thank you very much. Let's give him a hand.
Thanks.